Hi everyone, Jon Poker Chip Friedberg here with another episode of Stacking Chips, your strategy source for the 2007 World Series of Poker, the Bellagio Cup, and the dozens of other events going on right here in lovely Las Vegas. I have a lot of email questions that I want to get to today before bringing on my guest. I have a very well-known online player who's here as my guest today. His name is Matt Vengrin. He plays on the online screen named Plattsburgh. Matt is out here for his first, well, he's actually played in a few World Series events last year, but he's here for his first extended stay during the World Series. He's staying with a bunch of other big-name online players. He got off to a great start this year, final tabling the event number 3, which is a $1,500 no-limit tournament, and we'll talk a lot about that with Matt, as well as what it's like to live with all these other online pros and his experience in the World Series, etc., etc. So that said, I want to get right to these email questions, and I want to thank you guys for sending in the questions. We're getting lots of questions. Keep them coming to stackingchips@cardplayer.com. The first question comes from Cameron. Cameron writes, "Hey Jon, love the show. Question, it's the first hand of the World Series of Poker main event. You're on the cutoff with a pair of red jacks. The blinds are 25-50, 2 players limp, and you also limp, and the player on the button, who's a total stranger, moves all in for 10,000 in chips. Everyone else folds, and he accidentally flips over the ace-king of clubs. Do you call here?" That's an interesting question, and there's a lot of theoretical questions like this. My answer is no, I do not call here, and I'll tell you why. Yes, I have the best hand. I'm what, like a 56% here, or sorry, like a 54, 46, give or take situation. But here's my thought process. I don't want to gamble my entire World Series main event on one hand where I'm only a 54, 55% favorite, when realistically, being a better player than most players at the table, I'm probably a 70-30 against any random player. So I feel like I'm actually doing myself a disservice, so to speak, by putting my entire chip stack at risk here when I'm only a slight favorite. I would rather fold this hand and wait for better spots when I know I'm a bigger favorite, and not put my entire World Series of Poker main event life on a coin flip this early on in the tournament. There's a lot of other questions that come in about, you get aces and there's 4 people in front of you, and they're all in. Do you move all in here in the first hand of the main event? I don't know, tough spot, but that wasn't the question, so I'm not going to answer that one because it's too complicated. Next question comes from Josh in Louisiana, down in old LA. "First of all, Jon, great show. I've enjoyed all of the segments, guests, and the insights to different aspects of the game. My question has to do with how where you are physically playing will affect the way you attack the table or initially view other players around you. For example, how would you alter your play when you are in the South, say at Tunica, versus how you would play at somewhere like Foxwoods in Atlantic City, or sorry, Foxwoods or Atlantic City or the West Coast? I realize absolutely nothing is even close to being 100%, but what have been your general observations in regard to this? And when in a setting such as a World Series with such an international field of players, does where the player is from shape your image of that player initially?" That's an excellent question, and absolutely. I think in poker the stereotypes hold very true, where just from my experience I could elaborate this on a lot, which I'm not going to because that isn't really what you asked for, but basically yes. If a player's from the South, I treat that player very differently than the players from the East Coast or California. Not to racially discriminate, but I categorize Asian players a certain way, I categorize white players a certain way, I categorize European players a certain way, and I think most professionals probably do that. Asians have a tendency to play a very similar style. They love to gamble, they love action. Europeans, very aggressive players. They put a lot of pressure on the pots, they do a lot of bluffing. Just, different people from different areas sort of learn from each other, right? So when you have Europeans that are playing in Europe all with each other, they're all learning from each other, and that's very different than how people in Atlantic City are playing, who are also learning from each other. So similar styles of play absolutely adapt in certain regions, and having had the luxury of playing all over the world, I certainly noticed very different trends and very different styles of play in the different parts of the world and the U.S. that I travel to. So absolutely, I think it's important to understand that, and that way when you are playing in an international field such as the World Series main event, and all these other World Series events, it's very helpful to understand whether the person at your table is from Sweden or Finland or Los Angeles, etc., because it very much comes into play. Great question. The next question comes from Magoo, also in Louisiana. Magoo writes, "Hey John, I've been playing poker for 25 years and I just can't get a grasp for online poker. I'm a winning player in live games but just drown in online poker. My question is, why is it that young online players can adapt to live games, but it's much harder for older live players to adapt to online poker? I've read and heard that most older pros are break-even or losing players online. Is this a true statement?" Well, I'm going to actually also bring this up with my guest Matt today, because he is much younger than I am. He's 22, about to be 23, whereas I'm borderline old fart here, 32, about to be 33. But this is also a great question, and a lot of the older generation of players, or the older folks, whatever you want to call them, are having a lot of trouble profiting in the online games, and it's a very different world. These guys, most of the online players tend to be a much younger demographic. They have a very high risk tolerance. They're super aggressive, and basically they're just going to bully you out of the pots. But in addition to that, these guys, it's just a very different style of playing poker now online than it used to be playing live. So as an older player, you're used to playing one table of live poker where you're seeing probably 20 to 30 hands every half hour, so 50 to 60 hands every hour. These guys are playing 9, 15, some of them 24 tables simultaneously, and each table is dealing them 100 to 150 hands per hour. So they're seeing thousands of hands in a period where you would only see dozens of hands, and it's a very different style. They're not singling out any single hand to play strategically against their opponent based on how their opponent's been playing necessarily, but they're more so playing a broader range of poker where they're playing hands based on volume, not so much by situation. In addition to that, there's lots of software now. I had Isabel Mercier on the show maybe a week or two ago, and we were talking about Poker Tracker and Poker Race, and these are software programs that basically track your opponent's play. They put little numbers and statistics around each play at your table to talk about, or they give you information as to what type of hands they play, their aggression levels, how often they raise, how often they continuation bet. So they're using lots of analytical tools that you probably don't have, that you're probably not using. So in my opinion, playing online poker without these analytical tools that the other guys are using is like playing in the NFL without being on steroids when everyone else is on steroids. Now, I don't think that people in the NFL are on steroids. It's just an analogy where you're at a big disadvantage if you're not using all of the same tools that your opponents are using. That said, you're also at a disadvantage trying to play each hand situationally when you have these guys that are playing 10, 20 tables simultaneously that aren't paying attention necessarily to that particular hand and whether or not you might have been on tilt from 10 minutes ago. They're just playing these hands in sheer volume. So it's, again, very different. That was a good question, Magoo. Thank you so much. We got one more here for you today from a gentleman named Sims. Sims writes, "Hey John, love the show. You have some really great guests and great topics. My question is about online no-limit tournaments. Usually you start with about 1,500 in chips in most tournaments. I have a bit of trouble getting a stack and going, and I find that I'm fighting the rising blinds more often than not. If I don't get a big hand in the first few levels, I seem to die off quickly. I would like to know how to get a good stack going if the cards are not being very kind to you. Thanks, John, and good luck in the rest of the series." Well, thank you, Sims. That's a very tough question, and a lot of accumulating chips early in tournaments really has to do with the cards you're dealt, because there's not a ton of bluffing that really goes on necessarily. So, I guess my suggestion would be just to get better cards. No, that's a joke, obviously. But I think what you might want to consider doing is maybe not playing so tight, maybe playing position a little more, raising when if it gets folded to you and you're on the cutoff or on the button, maybe you want to make some more raises. Try to stimulate some action at your table more, and it might cost you a little bit in some hands where you continuation bet with nothing and you get raised so you fold. But eventually, if you establish your image to be a pretty loose and crazy player, you're going to eventually get a hand and you're going to get paid off on it. So maybe right now you're just, folding too many hands, and then you'll pick up an ace-king and you'll raise, and everyone will fold because they see that you've folded for the last 30 minutes and now you're raising a hand, so obviously you have a big hand. So what I would try to do is put some more raises in the pot, stimulate some action, loosen up your image at the table, and that way when you really do get some good hands, you're going to get paid off on them. Your opponents aren't going to be, they're not going to be able to tell that you have a good hand as easily. And again, it might cost you a little bit. You're going to make some, some raises pre-flop. You're going to make some continuation bets on the flop, and then you're going to have to surrender a lot of hands. But it is, in my opinion, a very plus EV investment because, again, you're not making any money there. In fact, you're losing on a lot of those hands. But in the long run, you're going to win because you're going to get paid off when you actually do have monsters. Something else you might want to consider is when you do get draws, flush draws or straight draws, get a little riskier with them. Put your chips in. Like one thing that a lot of these players who are very good at accumulating chips, like Barry Greenstein, for example, early in a tournament, these guys, and myself also, we don't just check call draws. When we get draws, we pound them pretty aggressively if we think that if we get there that we're going to have the best hand. And it's really good to put pressure on your opponents early on in a tournament. It's either going to knock you out of the tournament with no harm because you haven't invested too much time into it, or it's going to give you a big stack which you can ultimately use to get deep in a tournament and hopefully parlay into a final table and a win. So I would say if you find yourself just check calling nut flush draws or open-ended straight draws with two overcards or big hands, just treat them as if you already have the hand made. Certainly on the flop. So if you have the king queen of hearts and the flop comes 10 jack of hearts and a 5, and some guy makes a pot-sized bet or something, raise him. Don't just call there. Now, of course, that's an extreme. Like you're probably a huge favorite against any hand there, but same situation if you have the the ace 9 of hearts and the flop comes like 6, 7, 10 or something, again with 2 hearts. So now you got a straight draw, you got a flush draw. You need to pound those hands, get all your chips in on the flop, and just hope for the best. And first of all, what you're going to see a lot of the times is that your opponent's going to fold anyway, so you're going to accumulate chips. Secondly, more than half the time when your opponent calls in that spot, you're going to, well, half the time anyway, you're going to make your hand and you're going to double up. So you're going to find yourself accumulating chips better. And yeah, Sims, hopefully that's good advice for you. My guess is that you're playing too tight right now, and then when you do raise, your opponents see right through it because you're not playing enough hands and your image is too tight. So maybe you want to work on that. All right, again, thanks a lot for the questions, guys. Keep them coming to stackingchips@cardplayer.com. All right, I'm going to bring on my guest now. Again, his name is Matt Vengrin, and he plays under the online name Plattsburgh. That said, let's bring him on. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Matt Vengrin. Matt, thanks for coming on the show, man. Glad to have you here.
Sure, thank you.
So it's your first extended stay here at the World Series,
yep.
And you started off with a bang. The first $1,500 no-limit tournament, which is always like the biggest event in the World Series, you final tabled it, finishing in 9th place. So tell us a little bit about your background in poker and why you decided to come out here for the World Series this year, and then of course what it was like to get off to such a great start.
Sure. I'm actually in my last year of college at Plattsburgh State University, a psychology major. 2 years ago I played basketball on the college team for a while, and 1 year my friend he showed me poker, basically, a $5 sit and go, and I got hooked, pretty much. Then from then on, it was more poker and less basketball, and that was my last year playing basketball, which was about 2.5 years ago. So I've been playing for about 3 years. Like I said, I started small. I played small cash games. Limit. I started out with 1-2, 2-4 limit hold'em. Eventually started playing a little bit of tournaments. Had a little bit of success. I obviously had my ups and downs in the beginning. And then during the last year, it's been more steady. And like you said, coming out here to the World Series is just amazing. What made me come out was me and my buddy, in around January. I was actually traveling to Vegas for a week before I went to Australia, and we looked at a couple houses out here, and we found a great house. We have about 8 or 9 people staying there, and we rented the house and that's how I got here, basically.
I actually want to talk to you maybe a little later, and when we're talking, I want to bring that up and ask you about that.
Sure.
But let's talk a little bit about your final table. So it's either the first or one of the first events of the World Series, and you make a final table in the largest non-main event field in poker history, which, by the way, I actually own the title of winning the largest non-main event field in poker history. I did until this event when you final tabled, and I think you guys had like, what?
2,998, I believe.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you outlasted a field of, 2,990 players or something, and made it all the way to the final table. So, but you finished ninth.
Yes, that's
so.
correct.
Let's talk a little bit about your progress. Getting to the final table, and actually, tell us what happened at the final table.
Well, when I got to the final table, I was tied for third in chips, actually, and it was kind of a weird final table because the blinds were 20,000, 40,000, and the average stack was about 900,000. But the thing of it is, Alex Jacob had about half the chips in play almost. He had about 3.1 million, I believe. Maybe a little less than half, obviously. And then another guy had 1.7 million, and I was the one with like 960K, I believe. And there was one other guy around 900, and everybody else was real short. So, my initial idea was to pretty much stay out of Alex's way in the beginning, pick on the smaller stacks. And then, when I had to, I could go at him. But, getting there, I had three hands, basically, that I played. The first hand was just pretty standard. The guy opened a 120 under the gun +1. And I had to look down at Ace King. I made it 375K, and he mucked. Everybody folded behind. The second hand was kind of interesting. This I had about $1.1 million, I think, in chips, and I believe his name is Andreas Kraus. Raised from under the gun, he went all in for about 390K, I believe, give or take. And I looked down at two red nines on the button. Now, I could have just folded this, easily, but I know that his range under the gun with less than 10 big blinds is pretty wide. I mean, he could easily have, 8s, 7s, 5s, 6s, something like that. And if he did have a big pair, I was dead, but if he had, like, Ace Queen, Ace King, which I really put him on, like, an Ace King, Ace Queen, or, like I said, the range from 6s to 9s. So I reshoved all in, isolated, and the guys behind me had about 10 big blinds each, too. So I knew that they really couldn't call unless they picked up an absolute monster. And even if they did, I'd still have chips to play with. I'd still have about 700,000. Anyways, so I repushed all in, and he had Ace Queen. And it's a classic coin flip. I lost the coin flip. I actually lost it in a pretty brutal way, though. I would have rather him just hit the ace or queen. It came 7 deuce 3, and I think it came out running 4-5 for a wheel.
I hate that.
Yeah, it's. I know it's a coin flip, but it's a brutal way to lose it. And then the last hand actually I believe it was the hand right after this. I looked down at Ace Jack suited. The blinds went up to 30K, 60K. I had about 680,000 after the hand. And Alex Jacob, who had been raising, pretty liberally, and I know the type of player he is pretty aggressive, overall. So I look down at Ace Jack suited. He makes it 150 under the gun, and I know that he is raising under the gun, but I also know that his range is big. So I figured it was a good spot to push it in. I was ahead of his range. If he folded, that's great. I'm back up to like 1 million chips. If he calls, I don't necessarily mind the call. I'd rather him fold, obviously. But he thought for like 3 or 4 minutes and called the king queen, and actually I reshoved, obviously, and he had a queen on the flop, and that was it. 9th place.
Yeah, that's a very, I think, like a very common tough spot to be in there when you have the ace jack.
Yeah.
And I think situationally sometimes the shove is the right play. Sometimes just calling and seeing a flop is the right play if you have position.
Right.
And of course, sometimes the right play is a fold.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
you never know what the right play was until it's
exactly.
over,
and
you can look back in hindsight. But that's tough. I mean, when he calls and he turns over a king queen, in one sense you're happy. In another sense, now you're risking your tournament life and a difference of $600 and something thousand from 9th to 1st.
Right.
On basically you're slightly above a coin flip there.
Right.
So and then it seems like they get there every time in that spot, though, doesn't it?
I'd rather him flip over king jack.
Yeah, that would have been nice.
Yeah.
So that's unfortunate for you. I mean, you went in with the best and got unlucky. That's really all you can do.
Yeah.
But still off to a great start for the World Series.
Yeah.
You cashed for how much in that?
It was a little over 43,000. It's just a weight off my shoulders, though. It's kind of like the rest of the free roll.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So you mentioned to me that there were also a couple of other big hands that were leading up to the final table. one of them who was up against David Pham.
Mm-hmm.
So tell us about those hands.
Well, one of the key hands came on day 2. Day 1 was, I just played pretty tight in the beginning. I got like a decent stack pretty early. Then I had queens versus jacks, got me up to like 20,000. Actually, the biggest part, I believe, of getting this final table, one of the biggest, is chipping up on the bubble. I think I went from about 21K to 60K on the bubble without a showdown. And I just would raise, about half the hands per orbit. Everybody was just folding, or they'd fold to a C bet. Anyways, so I got up to 60K. I was one of the probably top 20 out of like 270 that were left. So day 2 came, and this was my biggest hand of the tournament. I chipped up from 60 to about 150. At about 150K, the blinds were 2,000, 4,000 with, I forget what the ante was. It was either 500 or 1,000. And then this hand came about. I made it 10,000 under the gun plus 1 with pocket 5s. Good sight too, but anyways. So I made it 10,000, and David Pham called out of the small blind. And he had about 170,000 total in the pot. And he'd been playing a lot of hands, So I wasn't sure where I was. I had position, which is, always great. Anyways, the big blind folded. The flop came 10-10 deuce. And he checked to me, and I figured I'd lead out at the pot, take a little stab. I bet about 15,000 into the pot. And he thought for a little while, and he re-raised to, I believe it was 32,000, which is very, very odd. I wasn't sure what he was doing. It kind of felt like a probe to see where he was at, maybe with a pair of 7s, a pair of 8s. I didn't want to re-raise pre-flop. So I thought about moving in on the flop, because I didn't think he was necessarily that strong, and the way I had played the hand, I could easily have a big pair. Probably not ace-10, but, it's obviously in the realm of possibilities. So I thought about pushing in, like I said, and eventually I just thought, I think I have the best hand here, actually, and if he has a pair of 7s or 8s or 9s, I can get him off it on the turn, usually, especially if a scare card comes. So I elected to just call 17,000 more. And the turn was another 2, so the board was 10-10-2-2. And he almost immediately bet 40,000 out of his 90,000 stack, or about 100,000. He bet about basically a little less than half a stack. Now, for some reason, I just felt like he wasn't that strong. I felt like he wasn't that strong, and if I misread the hand, if he had a strong hand like 7s, 8s, or 9s, then he's probably going to fold if I come over the top for his tournament life. I also thought that he could be making this stab with ace high, a lot of hands, but he would have re-raised, a variety. He would have re-raised 10s, pre-flop, jacks, queens, kings. I don't think he just cold calls there. So, I believe that my hand is good, and if it's not good, like I said, I can take him off. So I figure I have 90,000 in my stack right now, and I thought for some reason I just felt like if I pushed in, he was folding, because I just represented total strength on the hand. He would have to give me credit for it. So I pushed it in. It was, one of the most crazy times I've been playing poker, making a move like that late in day 2. And he thought for about 4 minutes, and it felt like an hour, And I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to call the clock on him or anything. Eventually, after about 2 minutes, I thought he was folding, because the way he was holding his cards, the way he was looking, just didn't feel like he wanted to call. So eventually he folds. He said he had pocket 4s. A little bit skeptical about that, but I guess that's within his range as well. So that got me, that almost doubled me up right there without even having to show down, and then I just kind of cruised, I guess, to the final table. It was tough around top 27 though. Yeah.
So have you done well in any events since then?
I actually right after that I bubbled 3 straight tournaments, which was very brutal. I bubbled the 5K. I went out at like 12 at night. The 5K, that was no limit, and then the 5K pot limit hold'em I as well went out about 51st, 36 paid. But then I also played another 1,500 no limit, and I actually went, same thing basically. I chipped up from 17,000 to 50,000 on the bubble without a showdown. Went into day 2 with about 60K, and I lost with ace jack to ace 10 all in pre for like a $100,000 pot. But yeah.
Nice. Well, hey, so one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which I mentioned, was you living in a house right now with a bunch of other online superstars, right? I think you said Premier, AK87. Johnster, I forget the other guys.
Wes Menlo, AA.
Yep. Just some real big names in poker who are out here, mostly for the World Series. I think you mentioned a couple of guys might not be 21 yet.
Right.
But what's it like to sort of come out here with all your buddies, all like top-notch players, and just stay here for the duration of the World Series?
Man, I never thought I'd be doing this a couple years ago. I was a lifeguard for a while, and it was a great job, but it was just nothing compared to this. This is just an amazing experience, I never thought poker would turn into something like this when I started playing $5 sit and goes. It's great. I mean, we have poker discussions at night. We'll all play online on Sundays. We've actually been at the same table once or twice where we have to move, move to the other side of the room. But it's great. I mean, we play poker during the day, at night sometimes, go out, we got a big pool and big jacuzzi in the back, so it's just amazing. I mean, these guys know what they're talking about. They're not even 21 yet. It's just sick to think of what they'll do in a couple of years. So,
well, everyone, all of this show's viewers know that I'm a true believer that the youngest generation of players, the online guys, are going to take over the world of poker. I mean, they've demonstrated their abilities here at the World Series this year in 2007, and like what Matt's just saying, so many of these guys still haven't even turned 21 yet. They're forced to play the European events, the Australian events, and the Caribbean events, but they still can't even touch the U.S. events yet. And when they can, again, the older school players are just they're gonna be in trouble because these guys are so good. So I imagine it's extremely beneficial to live in a house with these guys and share, hand histories and talk about, situations. What would you do in this spot? What would you do in that spot?
Absolutely.
Very helpful.
It's very helpful. I mean, most of these guys are double threats. They play tournaments and cash games. I mean, Wes Menlo, his name's Isaac Barron, as one of you might know, is just amazing. I mean, tournaments or cash, he's just top notch. I can't wait to see what he does in a couple of years.
So one of the email questions that came in today was from a fellow who had been playing poker for about 25 years and said that he's done pretty well live for the most part, but he just can't seem to win online. And how these younger players are so quick and good at adapting to the online play, whereas he's having trouble, and he asked me what my take was on it. What's your take on it? You're what, 22 years old, almost 23, and you're one of these people that this fellow was playing against that is having trouble. So, and I've also had some trouble initially, but talk a little bit about that. Like, why are the young guys so much better at online poker than the older people are?
Well, like you said, John, playing a lot of hands is pretty much, I believe, the best thing to do. I mean, experience is greater than what any book can teach you. I mean, books will teach you, the basics, what you should do with these hands in these situations. But it's really just, seeing hands. And I don't know how many hands I've seen. I would guarantee it's probably upwards of a couple million hands, though. I mean, like you said, on Sundays I'll play 8 or 10 tables at once, tournaments. These guys will play cash games, 8-table cash games all day, and see, I don't know how many hands it is, but it's a lot more than any live pro would do. Another aspect of it, I believe, is that the online players just are more aggressive than the old players. Like you touched on that as well. I played with a lot of pros this year, well-known pros on TV, and a lot of them are good. Like the guys like Daniel Negreanu, Alan Cunningham, Barry Greenstein, they're not going to go away, But I believe some of these other pros, I don't want to name names, play with a few of them, but I don't think that they're going to be having as much success as they've had. I mean, I'm sure playing solid will get them to the occasional final table, But yeah, like I said, it's a lot of experience, I believe. And as far as going from online to live, it's tough, but you just have to learn about physical tells, ticks, all that kind of stuff. Being a psych major helps with that too. So.
Yeah, I bet.
Or you can just go to school for that, either one.
All right. Well, Matt, thanks a lot for coming on the show, man. It was great to have you here.
Absolutely.
Best of luck in the rest of the World Series and beyond that.
Thanks.
All right, well, that's it for today's episode of Stacking Chips. Make sure to tune in tomorrow and every day throughout the World Series for more strategy talk, discussions, interviews, and more right here on Card Player TV. And keep those emails coming in to stackingchips@cardplayer.com. From Jon Poker Trip Friedberg
and Matt Vengrin,
we're out of here. Good luck, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.